Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So, I want you to picture something for a second. You are looking at a man who has, well, he's lost absolutely everything. He's lost his job, his family, his home.
Right. Total devastation.
Exactly. And the government will not help him because, frankly, the social safety net as we know it today hasn't even been invented yet.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist at all. And the local downtown church, the one you'd think he could turn to, has literally packed up its bags and moved out to the suburbs. It is 1872, the streets are freezing, and this guy has nowhere to go. So what do you do?
I mean, that is the ultimate crisis scenario.
Yeah.
Right? It's complete societal failure. And the answer to that exact question actually birthed an entire movement that, fundamentally reshaped urban survival.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're looking at today. We are opening a text that addresses that exact level of desperation. We're taking a deep dive into a foundational manual from the 1980s. It's called Gospel Rescue Mission Update Number 1, authored by Dr. Charles Y. Furness.
Published by the International Union of Gospel Missions, yeah.
Right. And I want to hook you right now as you're listening, because this is not some dusty theoretical history book. Like, it's not a textbook.
At all.
It's a gritty, boots-on-the-ground survival guide. I mean, it is a highly practical manual on how to build, fund, and run an organization that deals with the absolute rock bottom of human crises.
Yeah. And that adaptability is exactly what Dr. Furness wanted to capture in this manual. Our goal today is to pull out the underlying architecture of this text, because we're looking at a movement that started in these tiny single-room refuges in the late 19th century, right? Just responding to localized chaos.
Just absolute chaos, yeah.
And somehow they managed to transform into these highly structured, multifunctional hubs over the course of a century, dealing with both spiritual and physical rehabilitation.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is.
Yeah.
We need to understand how an organization actually survives world wars, economic depressions, and massive shifts in government policy without losing its soul.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the highly structured corporate approach of the 1980s manual, we have to look at the genesis of this whole movement.
At the very beginning.
Right. So the text places the birth of the true gospel rescue mission in 1872. There's this man named Jerry McCauley, and he opens a place called the Helping Hand for Men on Water Street in New York City.
Right, the Water Street Mission.
Yeah. Now, before we even get to Macaulay himself, the manual goes to great lengths, and it actually cites social historian Dr. James Libby here to paint the picture of the American city at that time. Like, what was creating this unprecedented level of desperation in the 1870s?
Well, you had a convergence of massive societal upheavals happening all at once. I mean, the nation was still reeling and physically rebuilding from the Civil War.
Which was devastating enough on its own.
Exactly. But simultaneously, you had these unprecedented waves of immigration just hitting the eastern seaports. Thousands of people arriving with absolute nothing to their names. And then add to that rapid, brutal industrialization.
Right. Cities just exploding in a population.
Yeah. But the specific demographic the text highlights for the 1870s is something they refer to as the tramp problem.
Which, when we hear that word today, tramp, it sounds like an antiquated insult, right? Like a cartoon character. But the manual describes it as a very specific demographic reality that was actually driven by the railroad boom.
Yeah, it was a massive economic byproduct. I mean, the expansion of the railroads required this enormous, highly mobile workforce. They needed hundreds of thousands of men just to lay track across the continent. But that industry was incredibly volatile. So when industrial depressions hit, or when a line was finally finished, you suddenly had massive surplus labor, just men with no jobs and nowhere to go.
So you have these literal armies of men who are completely untethered. Like, they aren't living in a village where their family has resided for 3 generations. They're traveling vast distances, moving from job to job, and then when the jobs dry up, moving from handout to handout.
And that transience is the key to understanding the crisis. They were completely disconnected from the traditional social safety nets of the 19th century.
Because back then, if you fell in hard times, you relied on who? Your extended family, your neighbors, your local parish?
Exactly. But these men had none of those things. They were isolated in these crowded cities, completely unmoored and, often turning to alcohol just to cope with the sheer brutality of their existence.
And so Jerry McCauley basically sets up shop on Water Street to catch these men. And the manual makes a very specific operational distinction here that I found fascinating. It does not call McCauley a missionary.
No, it doesn't.
It calls him a missioner.
Right. And the geographical and operational distinction there is profound. In traditional Christian terminology, a missionary is someone who is sent out, right?
Right. They go to the field.
Yeah, they travel into the field, maybe overseas, moving dynamically through a region to spread their message. A missioner, as defined by this text, operates on an entirely different philosophy.
They stay put.
Exactly. They establish a fixed location, they build a beacon or refuge in the darkest part of the city, and they just wait. The desperate come to them.
It's essentially the difference between a traveling doctor and a fixed trauma ward.
That's a great way to put it.
But this brings up a massive question for me looking at the text. It talks about these beautiful, established downtown churches with wealthy congregations that were already there.
Right.
So why was it left to a guy like Jerry McCauley, who, by the way, was an ex-convict and a former river thief, to build this trauma ward? Like, why couldn't the established clergy just open their massive wooden doors to these transient workers?
Well, the manual addresses that exact phenomenon directly. As those downtown neighborhoods became heavily industrialized, as they filled with noisy factories, massive commerce centers, and really crowded, squalid tenement, housing the middle and upper middle class congregations engaged in a massive physical flight.
They just left.
They relocated. They moved out to the emerging suburbs or to much quieter, affluent residential districts.
So the wealth and the traditional pastoral care literally walked away from the crisis.
They physically abandoned the very geography where the pain was most concentrated. So the downtown churches that remained grew weaker in resources and numbers at the exact historical moment when the need in their immediate shadow became exponentially stronger.
Wow.
And furthermore, the established clergy simply did not have the lived experience to minister to a transient alcoholic or a street criminal. What's fascinating here is how these early founders were not trained social workers.
Right.
They were individuals saved from similar destitute backgrounds. That was their vital credential.
That is such an important point. It wasn't a footnote. It was the core DNA of the early missioner. Like, they weren't seminary-trained theologians. When McCauley spoke to a destitute railroad worker, there was no condescension.
Not at all.
He was speaking with the empathy and the gritty, practical knowledge of a survivor. And the text emphasizes that this gave the gospel rescue mission this unreplicable authenticity.
Absolutely. But relying on pure grit and authenticity only gets you so far when the crises just keep changing. The bleeding never stopped, but the causes of the bleeding shifted dramatically over the next century.
Because history keeps moving.
Exactly. And because of that, the organizations had to evolve to survive. This leads perfectly into the text's 3 historical phases of missions. Dr. Furness breaks this survival down. Phase 1 is the initial emergency phase, which he dates from 1872 to 1926.
And that phase was just characterized by pure, raw survival, wasn't it?
Completely. In those early decades, there were virtually no government agencies, no municipal safety nets, and very few hospitals would expend resources on an alcoholic transient male.
Yeah, they were just invisible to the system.
Right, so the rescue missions were often the absolute only door that would open for them. It was pure triage, a bowl of soup, a warm fire, a cot, and the gospel message.
Then the timeline shifts in the manual. Phase 2 is called growing diversification, and that runs from 1926 all the way to 1980. So we're talking about the early automation of the 1920s wiping out unskilled jobs.
Yeah.
Followed by the catastrophic Great Depression, and then the massive societal realignment after World War II.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see how economic shifts directly dictate the types of programs a mission must invent. During this diversification phase, the demographic of the so-called down and outer fundamentally mutated.
It wasn't just the single guy on the railroad anymore.
Exactly. It was no longer just the transient single male. When the Great Depression hit, entire families found themselves unhoused. Runaway teenagers poured into urban centers looking for work. So the mission suddenly had to figure out how to shelter women, children, and displaced agricultural workers.
Wait, let me push back on this timeline for a second, because the timing of this diversification phase overlaps with something massive in American history. FBR rolls out the New Deal in the 1930s.
Right.
The federal government starts pouring unprecedented millions into welfare relief, public works, and eventually the creation of Social Security. How did these scrappy, privately funded soup kitchens not instantly close their doors?
It's a great question.
I mean, if the federal government is suddenly handing out survival checks and opening massive relief camps, shouldn't that have put these rescue missions out of business?
That is the most logical assumption you could make looking at the history. But it actually misses the core philosophy of the missioner. The missions didn't close because they realized a profound limitation of government bureaucracy.
Which was what?
Well, a government check can provide baseline biological survival, right? It can buy food, but it cannot cure holistic human misery.
Ah, right. A welfare check pays for the bread, but it doesn't cure the addiction. It doesn't fix the crippling isolation or the spiritual despair that these people were facing.
Exactly. And legally, government programs are these structural monoliths that just cannot provide highly personalized spiritual or relational rehabilitation. It's not what they're built to do.
Right, you can't legislate empathy.
Exactly. So the influx of government relief actually freed the missions to specialize. Because the government was handling the broad baseline financial survival for many families, the rescue missions could pivot their resources.
Oh, I see.
They began developing specialized drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. They opened battered women's shelters. They expanded from just being single-room soup kitchens into multifaceted social service complexes.
Which pushes them right into phase 3 of the manual, maturation of ministry and operation. This starts in 1981 and runs right up to the publication of the manual in 1987. And here, the text talks about a desperate need to professionalize administration.
Yes.
And ironically, they are dealing with the exact inverse of the 1930s. The early 1980s saw massive cuts to government social welfare programs.
Yeah. The Reagan-era shifts in social spending had a profound impact. You had massive cutbacks in federal housing and welfare grants, combined with the continued deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities.
Which just pushed thousands of people with severe psychological needs right onto the streets.
Exactly. The manual explicitly states that this mammoth scale of government pullback forced the primary safety net responsibilities right back onto the rescue missions. They had to professionalize their operations because suddenly they were managing the fallout of rapid computerization displacing older workers, the shuttering of mental hospitals, and this surging urban homeless population.
So if you're listening, just zoom out and look at the map at this point. You have a movement that started with one guy on Water Street in New York. And a century later, you have hundreds of these localized trauma wards scattered across the entire continent.
Coast to coast.
Right. And they're all trying to manage complex psychiatric needs, family displacement, and extreme addiction. But with hundreds of independent missions diversifying in completely different directions, how do you stop them from going rogue?
Right. It could be chaos.
Yeah. How do you maintain any kind of shared identity or quality control across the country?
Well, that organizational friction is exactly what led to the creation of the International Union of Gospel Missions, or the IUGM. It was officially incorporated in 1913, and it was heavily driven by a man named Sidney Whitmore.
Oh, right. The manual mentioned him.
Yeah, and he had actually caught the vision while volunteering at Jerry McAuley's original mission. So the lineage is direct.
The manual describes the organizing principle of the IUGM as a very delicate tightrope walk. Like, it is a system of radical local autonomy combined with voluntary central fellowship, which sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but that structure is absolutely vital. The IUGM does not own the missions. It has absolutely no legal jurisdiction, financial control, or operational authority over any individual member.
Oh, interesting. So they can't tell a local director what to do.
Not at all. Every single mission is entirely governed by its own local board of trustees. But the early founders recognized that total isolation was dangerous. They needed a central hub to share best practices, to prevent the duplication of services in the same city, and, frankly, to establish a standard of legitimacy.
Right. The text is actually pretty blunt about that last point. It says the union was necessary to distinguish the safe and sane mission from the fanatic, enthusiastic, and other solicitor missions.
Yeah, which is a very polite corporate way of saying, we need a union directory so the public knows who is doing legitimate, life-saving work and who is basically running a scam or a fringe cult.
Exactly. To bring order to this vast network, the IUGM started classifying the missions. And the manual lists 4 main historical categories, which really helps visualize what these places actually look like.
Right, gives a good physical picture.
So the baseline is the Gospel Hall mission. This is exactly what it sounds like, often just a rented storefront. Space is highly limited. They probably don't have overnight beds. So the primary function is just preaching, Bible study, and immediate crisis counseling.
Moving up in complexity, you have the lodging house, or dormitory mission. Now, this aligns most closely with the popular stereotype people have in their heads.
The soup line.
Exactly. It combines the gospel message with substantial physical relief, so mass feeding programs and massive rooms filled with cots for overnight shelter.
Then we get to the third category, which is a massive leap forward, the industrial mission.
Wow.
This is where the mechanics of rehabilitation really start turning, because they have the preaching and they have the beds, but they add an economic engine to it.
And the industrial mission is just a brilliant adaptation. They created internal businesses. We're talking massive wood yards, thrift stores, recycling, sorting facilities, or furniture repair shops right there on site. The men living at the mission would work in these industries, and this served two critical functions. First, it restored the psychological dignity of labor.
Because earning your keep fundamentally shifts your mindset compared to just receiving a handout.
Exactly. And second, and perhaps more importantly, it allowed the men to stay at the mission for extended periods. You cannot disciple and rehabilitate a man who only stays for one night. The industrial work provided the economic stability required for long-term recovery.
The fourth classification is the neighborhood or welfare mission. Now, these were less focused on the classic transient male and more focused on residential poverty. They set up clinics, after-school programs, and family outreach in deep inner-city neighborhoods.
Right.
But all of this classification leads to my absolute favorite part of the 1985 IUGM directory discussed in the manual. They use letters of the alphabet to classify services, right? And at the very end of the index is the category Z Other.
Yes. The items listed under Z Other are perhaps the strongest proof of the rescue mission's ultimate adaptability.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was astounded reading this list. Under Z Other, these missions are operating specialized alcohol detox clinics. They are running college-level Bible schools specifically to train inner-city pastors.
Yeah.
They have youth coffee houses, and they run foot clinics.
I know a foot clinic might sound strangely specific to us today, but think about the brutal physical reality of chronic transience.
Oh, right. You're walking everywhere.
Exactly. If you are unhoused, you are likely walking miles every single day, often in poorly fitting, decaying footwear.
Yeah.
Your feet are destroyed. So providing a specialized foot clinic is the ultimate expression of localized empathy. That's looking at the population right in front of you and saying, what is your most acute, immediate physical pain?
The list just keeps going, too. Under Z Other, they built juvenile offender centers, homes for the elderly, group homes for pregnant teenagers, and even a phone a story service for children.
It's amazing.
It completely shatters the stereotype of a grim room filled with rusty cots. I mean, if a neighborhood is so unsafe that kids are locked in their apartments and need a comforting voice on the telephone, the mission just builds the phone line.
They build whatever is needed. However, that exact capacity to build anything to diversify into these endless, complex social services introduced a massive existential threat to the organization.
Right.
And Dr. Furness devotes a significant portion of the manual to warning against this very danger.
This is the ideological core of the text. It's the tension between the word and the works. The manual insists unconditionally that a true gospel rescue mission must focus equally on the word, meaning the proclamation of the Christian gospel, and works, meaning the tangible, physical, social services.
This raises an important question regarding how organizations maintain their founding spiritual identity when external pressures demand they act purely as civic welfare agencies. To ground this dual mandate, the manual heavily quotes the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 18 and 19.
What does that passage say?
In this text, Jesus declares his mission is to preach the gospel to the poor. But the passage inextricably links that preaching to physical action, recovering sight to the blind, releasing the captives, and setting at liberty those who are bruised.
So the two things are tied together.
Exactly. It is a dual mandate.
Yeah.
Proclamation and physical alleviation simply cannot be severed.
But let me play devil's advocate here and ask the hard question. If a man is freezing to death on a park bench in January, why isn't handing him a heavy wool blanket and a hot meal enough?
Right.
Like, why does the manual view secular humanitarianism as a profound danger? If historians praise these missions for their incredible social work, why is the author so deeply paranoid about losing the preaching aspect?
Because you have to look at it through the theological worldview of the missioner. To them, human beings are not merely biological machines that require caloric input and thermal regulation.
They're eternal souls.
Exactly. And Dr. Furness points out a historical pattern in the text. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Many organizations started with a fiery religious motivation, but over time, they drifted into pure secular humanitarianism.
Why did they drift?
Well, they wanted to appear more professional to civic leaders, or they wanted to access broader secular funding pools, so they quietly just dropped the gospel message.
They sanitized the operation.
They did. But the manual argues that, from a biblical perspective, subtracting the gospel is actually removing the most essential, permanent form of assistance.
Because the blanket is temporary.
Right. If you only feed a man's body, he will simply be hungry again the next day. If you provide a blanket, but fail to address the spiritual void, the moral decay, or the deep enslavement to addiction, which the missioners viewed as the root causes of the visible despair, you are committing spiritual malpractice. You are applying a localized bandage to a fatal internal hemorrhage.
There is a quote from Jerry McCauley in the text that perfectly crystallizes this philosophy. He used to say, "I wash the man on the outside and God washes him on the inside."
That is the perfect synthesis of the whole movement. The physical bath restores dignity and hygiene, but the spiritual cleansing is what permanently alters the trajectory of the life.
But the manual also quotes a mission leader named Clifford Hartzell, who warns about the danger coming from the inside, not just external pressure. He talks about how incredibly easy it is for the staff to become totally consumed by the physical ministry.
Oh, absolutely. The burnout is real.
Yeah, the sheer crushing exhaustion of managing hundreds of beds, cooking thousands of meals, shoveling coal, and breaking up fights. He warns that the staff can become so focused on providing things that the spiritual vitality dies, resulting in what he calls blind leaders of the blind.
It highlights a vicious operational cycle. The physical needs of the urban poor are infinite and immediate. You can spend 24 hours a day sorting donated coats and still not close everyone.
Right, the line never ends.
Never. So if the leadership does not fiercely protect the spiritual mandate, reserving time for staff prayer, prioritizing the chapel services, maintaining a focus on individual discipleship, the mission devolves into a highly stressed, underfunded civic warehouse.
It is such a precarious tightrope. You have to maintain absolute spiritual purity while executing massive, grueling logistical operations. Which naturally makes you wonder, if you're listening to this, if this work is so specialized, so exhausting, and so vital, where is the traditional church in all this?
Well, the manual spends an entire section carefully defining the rescue mission's relationship to the broader Christian ecosystem. It categorically states that the mission is not a replacement for the local church. It defines it as a parachurch organization.
It functions as an extension. Some early historical figures even referred to it as the poor man's church. I like to think of this relationship using a medical analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of a healthy, vibrant local church as a general practitioner's office. A GP is absolutely essential to a community. They manage long-term health, they deliver babies, they provide incredible ongoing care.
Right.
But when a multi-vehicle pileup happens on the interstate, when you have individuals arriving with extreme, complex, compound trauma, you do not take them to the GP's waiting room. You rush them to a specialized trauma ward.
That captures the dynamic perfectly.
The rescue mission is the trauma ward. They have the reinforced doors, the specialized heavy machinery, the detox protocols, and the staff trained to handle violent outbursts or severe withdrawal. But, and this is the critical point the manual is trying to make, the GP and the trauma ward have to communicate. They must function within the same medical network for the patient to actually heal.
Yes. The manual stresses that the ultimate goal of the rescue mission, once a person has been physically stabilized, detoxed, and spiritually awakened, is to transition that individual into a local church for lifelong nurture and community integration.
Though it does realistically acknowledge that some individuals, particularly older men who have spent decades on Skid Row, carry such deep psychological shame that they will never feel comfortable sitting in a middle-class pew.
Yeah, that's a sad reality.
For those specific individuals, the mission effectively becomes their permanent pastoral home.
However, the manual sounds a massive alarm regarding the state of this parachurch ecosystem. It identifies a severe recruitment and relationship crisis between the missions and the local congregations.
Yes, the text is essentially pleading with the church. It outlines exactly why young, capable, energetic church members are not signing up to work at the missions. The first issue is just a simple lack of exposure.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. A suburban congregation might know a downtown mission exists, but their understanding is limited to a cartoonish stereotype of a soup line.
The manual points out that even when well-meaning church groups volunteer to conduct a Sunday evening chapel service, Their exposure is highly curated.
What do you mean?
Well, they drive in, sing their hymns, preach a quick sermon, and drive back to the suburbs. They never see the actual machinery of the mission. They do not witness the grueling hours of one-on-one addiction counseling, the complex legal advocacy, or the intricate administrative management required to keep the facility open.
They just see the surface.
Exactly. Because the true depth of the work is invisible to them, it fails to attract young professionals who want to utilize their advanced skills.
But the second reason for the recruitment crisis is much more insidious. The manual points to a false hierarchy of status within the Christian community.
This is a really tough point the book makes.
Yeah, there was an unspoken perception that foreign missions traveling overseas to a remote jungle or a distant nation was somehow more glorious or more spiritually elite than doing inner-city rescue work. Working with the local alcoholic, the mentally ill, or the drug addict in your own city's industrial district was quietly viewed as second-class service.
And Dr. Furness pushes back against this arrogance fiercely. He argues that the missioner who steps into the urban decay of a modern American city is executing one of the most intellectually demanding, sophisticated, and biblically mandated jobs on earth.
Period.
Right. They are dealing with deeply entrenched systemic trauma that requires professional psychiatric understanding combined with intense spiritual resilience. They are deliberately stepping into the exact neighborhoods that the established church abandoned. The text uses a devastating phrase, stating that the missions are working in the very areas where the traditional church has washed its hands and pulled its skirts close to itself.
Wow, pulled its skirts close to itself. That is a searing indictment of the suburban church's desire to avoid the messiness of urban poverty. The manual is essentially saying, we are in the trenches doing the harrowing work you walked away from, and we cannot survive if you do not send us your youth, your financial backing, and your active partnership.
And that desperation for survival forces the manual to transition from high-minded theology into the absolute grit of operational management. You can have all the theological purity and passionate volunteers in the world, but if the trauma ward isn't funded, organized, and legally compliant, the doors will close and people will freeze on the street.
This brings us to the mechanics of mercy, the administration and finance sections. Reading this part of the 1987 text is jarring because it suddenly reads like a ruthless corporate MBA syllabus.
It really shifts gears.
Dr. Furness insists that operating a charity is no excuse for sloppy management. In fact, the high stakes demand rigorous business principles.
The manual meticulously maps out the chain of command. It starts at the top of the board of trustees. They hold the legal charter, they own the property, and they are responsible for the broad strategic vision.
Right.
The board's primary operational duty is to hire the executive director. The director then manages the administrative staff, who in turn oversee the direct service staff, the intake workers, the cooks, the floor supervisors, the counselors.
The text emphasizes that every single individual in that hierarchy, from the board president down to the night shift security guard, must view themselves as a unified channel delivering service to the client. If the administrative staff is feuding with the direct service staff, the channel is blocked and the client suffers.
To ensure that the channel is actually effective, the manual introduces a very specific goal-setting framework using the acronym FORM, F-O-R-M.
Let's break this down because it's incredibly practical, even if you're not running a mission. It stands for feasible, observable, realizable, and measurable.
The manual insists that vague, overly spiritualized goals are totally useless in management. A goal must be feasible, meaning it is logically possible within the laws of reality.
You can't just say end all sadness.
Right. It must be observable, meaning you can physically see the change in the client's behavior or circumstances. It must be realizable, meaning the mission actually possesses the financial and staff resources to achieve it. And it must be measurable, meaning you can quantify the success on a timeline.
So saying, our goal is to bless the city, fails the form test completely. It's not measurable.
Nope.
But saying, our goal is to transition 20 men from the overnight shelter into the 6-month residential rehab program by December 1st passes perfectly. You can count the men, you can observe their participation, and it is feasible.
To execute those form goals, the manual pairs them with a 6-step progression for taking action. It is a chronological map for solving any organizational challenge. The 6 Ps.
Let's run a hypothetical scenario through these 6 Ps because this is the actual engine of how a mission operates. Let's say a mission in the mid-1980s realizes there is a massive spike in crack cocaine addiction among the men coming for the nightly soup line. They need a new approach.
Okay, so step 1 is the problem. You must accurately define what is broken. The problem isn't just a vague idea of drugs. The problem is that the current 3-day detox protocol is entirely insufficient for the neurochemical realities of crack cocaine.
Step 2 is the plan. The leadership sits down and conceptualizes the means to solve it. They decide they need to build a specialized, segregated 90-day recovery wing on the 3rd floor of the building.
Step 3 is policy. Before anyone picks up a hammer, the Board of Trustees must set the absolute rules. Who is eligible for this wing? What are the grounds for immediate expulsion? How does this align with the mission's spiritual mandate?
Step 4 is the program. This is the actual curriculum. It's the daily schedule. What time do the men wake up? When is group therapy? When is Bible study? Who is teaching the anger management class?
Step 5 is performance. This is where the theory hits the pavement. It is the grueling day-in, day-out reality of executing the program. It is the staff actually teaching the classes, managing the relapses, and enforcing the policies.
And finally, step 6 is the purpose. This brings it all back to the ultimate goal. Did completing this 90-day program result in a spiritually awakened, physically sober man who is ready to reintegrate into society?
But here is the brutal reality. You cannot execute those 6 Ps without airtight, bulletproof financial management. The manual's deep dive into accounting is incredibly strict, particularly regarding the separation of funds.
It harps endlessly on the strict separation of capital accounts versus general accounts.
This is a fundamental, non-negotiable principle of nonprofit accounting. Think of an organization as a human body. The capital is the skeleton. It is the permanent infrastructure, the brick and mortar building, the heavy industrial ovens in the kitchen, the delivery trucks.
Okay, skeleton.
The general operating fund is the blood. It is the daily consumable resources, the electricity bill, the staff salaries, the hundreds of pounds of potatoes for the evening meal.
If you stop pumping the blood to build more skeleton, the body dies. But why does the manual spend so many pages aggressively warning directors never to mix these funds? It seems obvious.
It comes down to the absolute sanctity of public trust. If a widow writes a $5,000 check and specifies it is for the roof replacement fund, which is a capital expense, and the executive director panics because they can't make payroll that week, and uses her money to pay salaries of general expense, they have committed a profound ethical and potentially legal violation.
To enforce this terror of financial mismanagement, the text cites a massive self-study conducted by the IUGM between 1980 and 1982, as well as directives from a newsletter called Stretch. These industry documents demanded that missions submit to independent CPA audits.
In the early 1980s, the public and the government were becoming highly skeptical of unregulated charities. There was a growing demand for total transparency. The manual warns that if a mission's books are a tangled mess of commingled funds, they will instantly lose the trust of their major donors and civic partners. Transparency is survival.
Which perfectly explains their philosophy on how to acquire those funds in the first place. The manual champions a fundraising approach heavily promoted by a leader named Lloyd Allen. The philosophy is simple: telling, not begging.
It fundamentally reframes the psychology of fundraising. A mission director is not a beggar pleading for scraps to keep a failing enterprise afloat. If the missions is executing its 6 Ps, if lives are genuinely being transformed from the brink of death, then the director is offering the donor an incredible opportunity.
You are just telling the factual, passionate story of what God is doing inside the walls of the mission, and you are giving the donor the privilege of investing their capital into that success. But when it comes to who you accept that capital from, things get incredibly complicated.
Very complicated.
There is a fascinating controversy detailed in the text regarding a funding source called the United Way, which it also refers to as the community chest.
This controversy circles entirely back to the ideological friction we discussed earlier, the tension between the secular and the spiritual. The United Way is a massive, secular civic organization that pools millions of dollars in community donations and distributes grants to local charities.
Right.
On a spreadsheet, securing a massive United Way grant seems like the ultimate financial victory for a struggling rescue mission.
So why was taking their money highly controversial?
Because of the strings attached to the money. Historically, many secular United Way boards or civic leaders were deeply uncomfortable with or outright hostile to the aggressive evangelistic nature of the rescue missions. They viewed the preaching as coercive or unscientific.
They were perfectly happy to fund the soup kitchen, but they absolutely refused to fund the sermon.
Precisely. A secular board might offer a desperately needed $50,000 grant to upgrade the kitchen, but they would attach a stipulation. If you take this money, You cannot require the men in the shelter to attend the evening chapel service, or you cannot use our funds to pay the salary of the chaplain.
But for the mission, that is a fatal compromise. That is abandoning Jerry McCauley's mandate to wash the inside of the man. If they drop the gospel requirement just to get the kitchen money, they believe they are fundamentally harming the client's eternal soul. They are reverting to the trap of secular humanitarianism.
The manual advises extreme, calculated caution. It does note that in certain cities where the civic leadership was friendly to the mission's historic Christian identity, the partnerships worked beautifully. But the overarching warning is clear. An executive director must navigate secular funding with intense scrutiny to ensure they do not slowly sell their theological soul just to keep the lights on.
It is an agonizing high-stakes balancing act. So let's assume the mission has survived the tightrope. The finances are audited by a CPA. The staff is rigorously trained using the 6 Ps. The local church is sending informed volunteers, and they haven't compromised their message.
The ideal scenario.
Right. What actually happens to the broken man who walks through the front door?
Sure.
How is the trauma ward structured?
The manual makes it very clear that while the nightly gospel chapel service remains the beating heart of the mission, the primary intersection point where the transient individual is confronted with a spiritual message, the actual architecture of rehabilitation requires vast amounts of time and structure.
It's not a magical overnight fix.
Not at all.
The manual details incredibly intense discipleship programs. It highlights the Central Union Mission in Washington, D.C. as a prime example of how to build a curriculum. They didn't just offer a cot, they offered a massive, phased educational approach.
The Central Union Mission structured their rehabilitation into 3 distinct, grueling phases. Phase I was a 15-week basic Bible course. If a man completed that, he moved to Phase II, which was a 15-week discipleship course focusing on deeper character transformation. Finally, Phase III was a 12-week supervised self-study program aimed at preparing the man for independence.
Do the math on that. That is 42 weeks. That is nearly an entire year of daily, intensive, structured educational and spiritual rehabilitation. And you cannot complete a year-long curriculum if you are wandering the streets looking for a meal every afternoon.
Impossible.
The mission had to provide the complete ecosystem. The food, the shelter, the safety, the clothing for that entire year so the internal transformation could actually take root.
The sheer logistical weight of maintaining that ecosystem requires the organization to be endlessly adaptable.
And that concept of adaptability brings me to my absolute favorite story in the entire manual. It is a brief anecdote, but it captures everything we've talked about today. Dr. Furness describes a rescue mission that is celebrating its 90th anniversary.
It is a brilliant illustration of operational flexibility.
The author notes that when this mission was founded 90 years prior, its primary operational program, its economic and physical engine, was a wood yard. Transients would come in off the street, they would be handed an axe, and they would chop wood for a few hours.
Right.
That labor earned them their keep, paid for their meal, and secured their bed after they heard the gospel. In the late 1800s, chopping wood was a highly relevant industrial task.
But 90 years later, the author observes the anniversary celebration. The mission is massive. It is thriving. Lives are still being miraculously transformed, and the gospel message is still ringing out from the chapel pulpit every single night. But the woodyard is entirely gone.
So what does this all mean? It has been paved over or turned into a classroom. What does that mean for you, the listener? It means the methods must constantly, ruthlessly change.
Yeah.
You bulldoze the woodyard when society no longer needs chopped wood. You build a computer literacy lab, you hire psychiatric nurses, you open a foot clinic, you continuously change the vehicle to perfectly match the demographic reality of the decade. But the core cargo, the unwavering commitment to spiritual redemption and holistic physical rescue never changes.
The permanence of the gospel rescue mission's identity is entirely secured by the absolute flexibility of its operations.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We have traced the DNA of this movement from a single freezing room on Water Street in 1872 to a highly sophisticated continent-wide network navigating the complex socioeconomic realities and corporate demands of the 1980s.
It's quite a journey.
And the reason this 1987 manual matters to you, listening right now, whether you are trying to manage a nonprofit, lead a corporate team, or you are just deeply curious about the mechanics of human resilience, is that it provides a timeless blueprint for survival.
Stay fiercely, unapologetically loyal to your core mission and your founding identity, but remain infinitely adaptable in how you execute it.
Because the terrifying problems of the 1870s, massive technological displacement, crushing addiction, extreme social isolation, and economic depression, are the exact same root problems we face in our cities today. They are just wearing different clothes.
And reflecting on this century of continuous, exhausting crisis response leaves us with a provocative final thought to ponder based on the manual's vision. If a gospel rescue mission's ultimate stated goal is the total rehabilitation of society through spiritual and physical healing, does a truly successful mission eventually put itself out of business?
That's the dream, right?
Yeah, but is it realistic? Or is human frailty and systemic brokenness a permanent, recurring feature of society that the rescue mission, the triage tent on the battlefield, is actually the most permanent institution we have?
Are we destined to always need the trauma ward in the muddy waters? It's something to think about as you look at your own city. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to take these insights and consider how you balance the word and the works, the unyielding vision, and the flexible execution in your own life and communities.
Thank you for listening.